Section 29 of Wagner the Wehr-Wolf by George W. M. Reynolds. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28. A Fearful Accusation. Fair and beauteous art thou, O city of flowers, with thy domes and spires, and turrets overlooking the Arno's silver stream, and crowding together in that river's classic pale, surrounded too by oak-covered hills, and cypress groves, and gardens of olives and evergreens, and presenting to the view of the spectator who stands on the lofty summit of Monte Senario, so vast an assemblage of places as to justify the saying of Ariosto, that it seemed as if the very soil produced them. Or seen from the olive-crowned hill of Fiesole, consecrated by the genius of Milton, how glorious is thy rich combination of beauty, thou Athens of Etruria! The sun dawned upon the eventful night, the incidents of which have occupied so many chapters. The golden flood poured upon the Florentine scene, so fair even in winter, bathing in yellow luster the mighty dome of the Cathedral of St. Mary, the Ducal Palace on its left, and the cupola of the Medicean chapel on its right, and bringing out into strong relief against the deep foliage of the evergreens the marble fronts of palaces, villas, and convents, seated amidst the hills, or scattered through the vale, the whole affording a rich and varied view, as if eternal summer reigned in that delightful region, and beneath the purple canopy of that warm Italian sky. Alas that the selfish interests, dark passions, conflicting feeling, clashing aims, and black crimes of men should mar the serenity and peace which ought to maintain an existence congenial to this scene. Scarcely had the orient beams penetrated through the barred casements of the Jew Isaachar's house in the suburb of Alla Croce, when the old man was awakened from a repose to which he had only been able to withdraw a couple of hours previously, by a loud and impatient knocking at his gate. Starting from his couch, he glanced from the window, and, to his dismay, beheld the lieutenant of police, accompanied by half a dozen of his terrible sbirri, and by an individual in the plain sober garb of a citizen. A cold tremor came over the unhappy Israelite, for he knew that this official visit could bode him no good, and the dread of having encountered the resentment of the Count of Arestino immediately conjured up appalling scenes of dungeons, chains, judgment halls, and tortures, to his affrighted imagination. The dark hints which Manuel d'Orsini had dropped relative to the possibility of the count's discovering the affair of the diamonds, and the certain vengeance that would ensue, flashed to the mind of Isaachar ben Solomon, and he stood, as it were, paralyzed at the window, gazing with the vacancy of despair upon the armed men, on whose steel morions and pikes the morning sunbeams now fell in radiant glory. The knocking was repeated more loudly, and with greater impatience than before; and Isaachar, suddenly restored to himself, and remembering that it was dangerous as well as useless to delay the admittance of those who would not hesitate to force a speedy entry, huddled on his garments and descended to the door. The moment it was opened, the sbirri and the citizen entered, and the lieutenant turning shortly round upon the Jew, said, "His Excellency the Count of Arestino demands, through my agency, the restoration of certain diamonds which his lordship has good reason to believe are in your possession. But think not that his lordship is desirous of plundering you of these jewels which you hold as security for certain moneys advanced, for here is the gold to repay thee." Thus speaking, the lieutenant produced from beneath his cloak a heavy bag of gold; and Isaachar, now considerably relieved of his apprehensions, led the way into the apartment where he had received the Marquis of Orsini and Stephano de Verrina during the past night. "Hast thou heard my message, Israelite?" demanded the lieutenant.
"Yes, yes; and his lordship is a worthy man, an estimable man, no oppressor of the poor defenseless Jew is he. Would that Florence abounded in such nobles as the Count of Arestino!"
"Cease thy prating, Jew, and let us dispatch this business," cried the officer. "You see," he added, glancing toward his men, "that with these at my disposal, the ransacking of your dwelling would be a light and easy matter."
"I will not render it necessary,"
returned the Jew.
"Tarry ye here a few moments, and the diamonds shall be delivered up."
Isaachar proceeded into another apartment, the lieutenant following him as far as the passage to see that he did not escape. When the old man returned, he had a small rosewood case in his hand, and from this box he produced the stones which had been extracted from the settings the very day the jewels were first mortgaged to him. "Now, signor," said the lieutenant, turning to the citizen in the plain sober garb, "as you are the diamond merchant of whom his lordship the count originally purchased the precious stones, which have been traced to the possession of Isaachar, it is for you to declare whether those be the true diamonds or not." The citizen examined the stones, and having pronounced them to be genuine ones, took his departure, his services being no longer required. The lieutenant secured the rosewood case with its valuable contents about his person, and then proceeded to settle with interest the amount claimed by the Jew as the sum which he had advanced on the jewels. While this transaction was in progress, the notice of one of the sbirri was attracted by the marks of blood which appeared on the floor, and which, as the reader will recollect, had been caused by the wound that the Marquis of Orsini had received from the robber Stephano. "It is decidedly blood," whispered the sbirro to one of his companions. "Not a doubt of it," observed another. "We must mention it to the lieutenant when he has done counting out that gold." "Do you know what I have heard about the Jews?" asked the first speaker, drawing his comrade still further aside. "What?" was the general question. "That they kill Christian children to mix the blood in the dough with which they make the bread used at their religious ceremonies," answered the sbirro. "Depend upon it, Isaachar has murdered a Christian child for that purpose," said one of his companions. This atrocious idea gained immediate belief among the ignorant sbirri; and as the Jew now quitted the room for a few moments to secure the gold which he had just received, in his coffer in the adjacent apartment, the police officers had leisure to point out to their superior the traces of blood which they had noticed, and the suspicion which these marks had engendered. The lieutenant was not further removed beyond the influence of popular prejudice and ridiculous superstition than even his men; and though by no means of a cruel disposition, yet he thought it no sin nor injustice to persecute the Hebrew race, even when innocent and unoffending. But now that suspicion, or what he chose to consider suspicion, pointed at Isaachar ben Solomon as a dreadful criminal, the lieutenant did not hesitate many moments how to act. Thus, when the Jew returned to the room with the fond hope of seeing his visitors take their speedy departure, he was met by the terrible words uttered by the officer of the sbirro. "In the name of the most high inquisition, Isaachar, do I make you my prisoner?" The unhappy Jew fell upon his knees, stunned, terrified by the appalling announcement; and although he assumed this attitude of supplication, he had not the power to utter a syllable of intercession or of prayer. Horror had for the moment stricken him dumb; and a thousand images of terror, conjured up by the fearful words "the inquisition," suddenly sprung up to scare, bewilder, or overwhelm him. "Bind him gag him!" ejaculated the lieutenant; and this order was immediately obeyed, for whenever a prisoner was about to be conveyed to the dungeons of the inquisition, he was invariably gagged, in order that no questions on his part might evoke answers at all calculated to afford him a clew as to the cause of his arrest. This precaution was originally adopted in reference to those only who were ignorant of the charges laid against them; but it had subsequently become common in all cases of arrest effected in the name or on the part of the Holy Brotherhood. The Palazzo del Podesta, or Ducal Palace, was one of the most celebrated edifices in Florence. In strong contrast with the various beautiful specimens of composite Tuscan, combined with a well assimilated portion of the Grecian character, which abounded in Florence, the ducal palace was remarkable for the stern and gloomy character of its architecture. Its massive and heavy tower, crowned with embattled and overhanging parapets, seemed to frown in sullen and haughty defiance at the lapse of time. The first range of windows were 12 feet from the ground, and were grated with enormous bars of iron, producing a somber and ominous effect. Within were the apartments of the duke's numerous dependents, and the lower portion of the palace had been rendered thus strong to enable the edifice to withstand a siege in those troublous times, when the contentions of the Guelphs and Ghibellines desolated Florence. On the second floor there was in front a plain and simple architrave, and on that story the windows were high and arched, for those casements belonged to the ducal apartments. The upper stories were in the same style, but the general aspect was stern and mournful to a degree. The palace was built, as indeed nearly all the Florentine mansions then were, and still are, in the form of a square; and around this court, which was of an antique and gloomy cast, were numerous monumental stones, whereon were inscribed the names of the nobles and citizens who had held high offices in the state previous to the establishment of the sway of the Medici. It was beneath the Palazzo del Podesta that the dungeons of the criminal prison, and also those of the Inquisition, were situated. In a cell belonging to the former department, Fernand Wagner was already a captive; and Isaachar ben Solomon now became the inmate of a narrow, cold, and damp stone chamber, in that division of the subterrane which was within the jurisdiction of the Holy Office. Section 30 of Wagner the Wehr-Wolf by George W. M. Reynolds. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 29. The visit of the banditti to the Riverola Palace. It was Monday night, and within an hour of the time appointed by Stephano for the meditated invasion of the Riverola Palace. Francisco had already retired to rest, for he was wearied with vain and ineffectual wandering about the city and its environs in search of some trace that might lead him to discover his lost Flora. Indeed, the few days which had now elapsed since her mysterious disappearance had been passed by the young count in making every possible inquiry and adopting every means which imagination could suggest to obtain a clue to her fate. But all in vain; and never for a moment did he suspect that she might be an inmate of the Carmelite convent, for, although he was aware of the terrible power wielded by that institution, yet feeling convinced that Flora herself was incapable of any indiscretion, it never struck him that the wicked machinations of another might place her in the custody of the dreaded Carmelite abbess. We said that Francisco had retired to rest somewhat early on the above mentioned night; and the domestics, yielding to the influence of a soporific which Antonio, the faithless valet, had infused into the wine which it was his province to deal out to them under the superintendence of the head butler, had also withdrawn to their respective chambers. Nisida had dismissed her maids shortly before 11, but she did not seek her couch. There was an expression of wild determination, of firm resolve, in her dark black eyes, and her compressed lips, which denoted the courage of her dauntless but impetuous mind. For of that mind the large piercing eyes seemed an exact transcript. Terrible was she in the decision of her masculine, oh, even more than masculine, character; for beneath that glorious beauty with which she was arrayed beat a heart that scarcely knew compunction, or that, at all events, would hesitate at nothing calculated to advance her interests or her projects. Though devoured with ardent passions, and of a temperament naturally voluptuous and sensual even to an extreme, she had hitherto remained chaste, as much for want of opportunity to assuage the cravings of her mad desires, as through a sentiment of pride. But since she had loved Wagner, the first and only man whom she had ever loved, her warm imagination had excited those desires to such a degree that she felt capable of making any sacrifice save one, to secure him to herself. And that one sacrifice which she could not make was not her honor. No, of that she now thought but little in the whirlwind of her impetuous, ardent, heated imagination; but, madly as she loved Fernand Wagner, that is, loved him after the fashion of her own strange and sensual heart, she loved her brother still more; and this attachment was at least a pure, holy sentiment, and a gloriously redeeming trait in the character of this wondrous woman, of a mind so darkly terrible. And for her brother's sake, it was that there was one sacrifice a sacrifice of a tremendous but painfully persevered in project, which she would not make even to a love for Fernand Wagner. No, rather would she renounce him forever rather would she perish, consumed by the raging fires of her own ungratified passions, than sacrifice one tithe of what she had deemed to be her brother's welfare to any selfish feeling of her own. Wherefore do we dwell on this subject now? Because such was the resolution which Nisida vowed within her own heart, as she stood alone in her chamber, and fixed her eyes upon a document bearing the ducal seal that lay upon the table. The document contained the decision of his highness in respect to the memorial which she had privately forwarded to him in accordance with the advice given her a few days previously by Dr. Duras. The duke lost no time in vouchsafing a reply, and this reply was unfavorable to the hopes of Nisida. His Highness refused to interfere with the provisions of the late Count's will, and this decision was represented to be final. Therefore it was that Nisida solemnly vowed within herself to persevere in a course so long ago adopted, and ever faithfully, steadily, sternly adhered to since the day of its commencement; and, as if to confirm herself in the strength of this resolution, she turned her eyes with adoring, worshipping look toward the portrait of her maternal parent, those eloquent, speaking orbs seeming almost to proclaim the words which her lips could not utter. "Yes, mother, sainted mother, thou shalt be obeyed." Then she hastily secured the ducal missive in an iron box where she was in the habit of keeping her own private papers, and which opened with a secret spring. Did she, then, mean to renounce her love for Wagner? Did she contemplate the terrible alternative of abandoning him in his misfortune, in his dungeon? No, far from that. She would save him if she could; she would secure him to herself, if such were possible; but she would not sacrifice to these objects the one grand scheme of her life, that scheme which had formed her character as we now see it, and which made her stand alone, as it were, among the millions of her own sex. And it was to put into execution the plan which she had devised to effect Wagner's freedom, that she was now arming herself with all the resolution, all the magnanimity, all the firmness with which her masculine soul was capable. The dial on the mantel in the chamber marked the hour of 11, and Nisida commenced her preparations. Having divested herself of her upper garment, she put a thin, but strong and admirably formed corselet, made so as to fit the precise contour of her ample bust, and completely to cover her bosom. Then she assumed a black velvet robe, which reached up to her throat, and entirely concealed the armor beneath. Her long flexible dagger was next thrust carefully into a sheath formed by the wide border of her stomacher, and her preparations for defense in case of peril were completed. She now took from a cupboard 6 small bags, which were nevertheless heavy, for they were filled with gold, and these she placed on a table. Then seating herself at that table, she wrote a few lines on several slips of paper, and these she thrust into her bosom. Having accomplished her arrangements thus far, the Lady Nisida took a lamp in her hand, and quitted her apartments. Ascending a staircase leading to the upper story, she paused at one of several doors in a long corridor, and slowly and noiselessly drew the bolt, by which the door might be fastened outside. This was Antonio's room, and thus, by Nisida's precaution, was he made a prisoner. She then retraced her way to the floor below, and proceeded to the apartment in which her father breathed his last, and where the mysterious closet was situated. No one until now had entered that room since the day of the late count's funeral, and its appearance was gloomy and mournful in the extreme, not only on account of the dark and heavy hangings of the bed, and the drawn curtains of the windows, but also from the effect of the ideas associated with that chamber. And as Nisida glanced toward the closet door, even she trembled, and her countenance became ashy pale; for not only did she shudder at the thought of the horrors which that closet contained, but through her brain also flashed the dreadful history revealed to her by the manuscript, of which, however, only a few lines have as yet been communicated to the reader. But she knew all she had read the whole, and well, oh! well she might shudder and turn pale. For terrible indeed must have been the revelations of a manuscript whereof the few lines alluded to gave promise of such appalling interest, those lines which ran thus: "Merciless scalpel hacked and hewed away at the still almost palpitating flesh of the murdered man, in whose breast the dagger remained deeply buried a ferocious joy a savage, hyena like triumph now." But we are to some extent digressing from the thread of our narrative. Nisida placed the lamp in the chimney, in such a way that its light was concealed so as to leave all the immediate vicinity of the door in a state of complete darkness; and she seated herself in a chair close by, to await the expected events of midnight. Slowly passed the intervening 20 minutes, and the lady had ample leisure to reflect upon all the incidents of her life, ay, and to shudder too at one which had dyed her hand with blood the blood of Agnes. Yet though she shuddered thus, she did not look upon it with that unbounded, tremendous horror that would be experienced by a lady similarly placed in these times. For jealousy was a feeling that, by the tacit convention of a vitiated society, was an excuse for even murder; and moreover, she possessed the true Italian heart, which deemed the death of a rival in love a justifiable act of vengeance. But she felt some compunction because she had learnt, when it was too late, that Agnes was not the mistress of Fernand Wagner, and she was convinced that in affirming this much she had uttered the strictest truth. Thus was she rather grieved at the fatal mistake than appalled by the deed itself; and she shuddered because she knew that her fearful impetuosity of disposition had led to the unnecessary deed which had entailed so dark a suspicion and so much peril upon her lover. She was in the midst of these and other reflections connected with the various salient features of her life, when the door of the room was slowly and cautiously opened, and a man entered bearing a lantern in his hand. Two others followed close behind him.
"Shut the door, Lomellino,"
said the foremost.
"But are you certain that this is the room?"
asked the man thus addressed. "Certain," was the reply.
"Antonio described its situation so clearly." "Then why did he not join us?" "How do I know? But that need not prevent us."
Nisida at this moment raised the lamp from the fireplace, and the light flashing at that end of the room produced a sudden start and ejaculation on the part of the banditti.
"Perdition!"
cried Stephano.
"What can this mean?"
Nisida advanced toward the robbers in a manner so calm, so dignified, so imperious, and so totally undaunted by their presence, that they were for a moment paralyzed and rooted to the spot as if they were confronted by a specter. But at the next instant Stephano uttered an exclamation of mingled surprise and joy, adding, "By my patron saint, Lomellino, this is the very lady of whom I spoke to you the other evening!"
"What, the one who did the business so well in?"
"Yes, yes," cried Stephano hastily. "You know what I mean in Wagner's garden. But " Nisida had in the meantime drawn from her bosom one of the slips of paper before alluded to, and, handing it to the bandit chief, she made a hasty and imperious motion for him to read it. He obeyed her with a mechanical submission produced by astonishment and curiosity, mingled with admiration for that bold and daring woman, whom he already loved and resolved to win. But his surprise was increased by a hundredfold when he perused these lines:
I am the Lady Nisida of Riverola. Your design is known to me, it matters not how. Rumor has doubtless told you that I am deaf and dumb, hence this mode of communicating with you. You have been deluded by an idle knave, for there is no treasure in the closet yonder. Even if there had been, I should have removed it the moment your intended predatory visit was made known to me. But you can serve me, and I will reward you well for your present disappointment."
"What does the paper say?"
demanded Lomellino and Piero, the captain's two companions, almost in the same breath.
"It says just this much,"
returned Stephano, and he read the writing aloud.
"The Lady Nisida!"
ejaculated Lomellino.
"Then it is she who used her dagger so well in Wagner's garden."
"Peace, silly fool!" cried Stephano. "You have now let out the secret to Piero. True, 'tis no matter, as he is as staunch to me as you are, and therefore he may as well know that this lady here was the murderess of that young female in Wagner's garden, for I saw her do the deed when I was concealed among the evergreens there. She is as much in our power as we are in hers, and we will let her know it if she means any treachery." "But how could she have discovered that we meant to come here to night, and what our object was?" asked Piero.
"Antonio must have peached, that's clear,"
returned Stephano.
"and therefore he did not join us, as agreed, in the hall downstairs. But no matter. It seems there's gold to be earned in this lady's service; and even if there wasn't, I have such an affection for her I would cut the throat of the duke or the cardinal archbishop himself merely to give her pleasure."
Then turning toward Nisida, whose courage seemed partially to have abandoned her, for her countenance was ghastly pale, and her hand trembled so that it could scarcely hold the lamp, Stephano made a low bow, as much as to imply that he was entirely at her service. Nisida made a powerful effort to subdue the emotions that were agitating her, and advancing toward the door, she made a sign for the banditti to follow her. She led them to her own suite of apartments, and to the innermost room, her own bedchamber, having carefully secured the several doors through which they passed. The banditti stood round the table, their eyes wandering from the 6 tempting looking money bags to the countenance of Nisida, and then back to the little sacks. But Stephano studied more the countenance than the other objects of attraction; for Nisida's face once more expressed firm resolution, and her haughty, imperious, determined aspect, combined with her extraordinary beauty, fired the robber chieftain's heart. Taking from her bosom another slip of paper, she passed it to Stephano, who read its contents aloud for the benefit of his companions.
"The trial of Fernand Wagner will take place this day week. If he be acquitted, your services will not be required. If he be condemned, are ye valiant and daring enough,
sufficiently numerous ye are, being upward of 50 in all, to rescue him on his way back from the judgment hall to the prison of the ducal palace. The 6 bags of gold now upon the table are yours, as an earnest of reward if ye assent. Double that amount shall be yours if ye succeed."
"It is a generous proposition,"
observed Lomellino. "But a dangerous one," said Piero. "Nevertheless, it shall be accepted, if only for her fair self's sake," exclaimed Stephano, completely dazzled by Nisida's surpassing majesty of loveliness. Then, with a low bow, he intimated his readiness to undertake the enterprise. Nisida handed him a third paper, on which the following lines were written:
Take the gold with you, as a proof of the confidence I place in you. See that you deceive me not, for I have the power to avenge as well as to reward. On Sunday evening next let one of you meet me at 10 o'clock near the principal entrance of the Cathedral of St. Mary, and I will deliver the written instructions on the mode of proceeding which circumstances may render necessary."
"I shall keep the appointment myself," said Stephano to his companions; and another obsequious but somewhat coarse bow denoted full compliance with all that Nisida had required through the medium of the slips of paper. She made a sign for the banditti to take the bags of gold from the table, an intimation which Piero and Lomellino did not hesitate to obey. The private staircase leading into the garden then afforded them the means of an unobserved departure, and Nisida felt rejoiced at the success of her midnight interview with the chiefs of the Florentine banditti. Section 31 of Wagner the Wehr-Wolf by George W. M. Reynolds. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 30: Flora's Captivity, a Companion, the Living Tomb. 6 days had now elapsed since Flora Francatelli became an inmate of the Carmelite convent. During this period she was frequently visited in her cell by Sister Alba, the nun who had received her at the bottom of the pit or well into which she descended by means of a chair; and that recluse gradually prepared her to fix her mind upon the necessity of embracing a conventual life. It was not, however, without feelings of the most intense, the most acute, the most bitter anguish, that the unhappy maiden received the announcement that she was to pass the remainder of her existence in that monastic institution. All the eloquence, all the sophistry, all the persuasion of Sister Alba, who presided over the department of the penitents, failed to make her believe that such a step was necessary for her eternal salvation.
"No,"
exclaimed Flora,
"the good God has not formed this earth so fair that mortals should close their eyes upon its beauties. The flowers, the green trees, the smiling pastures, the cypress groves were not intended to be gazed upon from the barred windows of a prison house."
Then the nun would reason with her on the necessity of self denial and self mortification, and Flora would listen attentively; but if she gave no reply, it was not because she was convinced. When she was alone in her cell, she sat upon her humble pallet, pondering upon her mournful condition, and sometimes giving way to all the anguish of her heart, or else remaining silent and still in the immovability of dumb despair. Her suspicions often fell upon the Lady Nisida as the cause of her terrible immurement in that living tomb, especially when she remembered the coldness with which her mistress had treated her a day or two previous to her forced abduction from the Riverola Palace. Those suspicions seemed confirmed, too, by the nature of the discourse which Sister Alba had first addressed to her, when she upbraided her with having given way to "those carnal notions, those hopes, those fears, those dreams of happiness which constitute the passion that the world calls love." The reader will remember that Flora had suspected the coolness of Nisida to have risen from a knowledge of Francisco's love for the young maiden; and every word which Sister Alba had uttered in allusion to the passion of love seemed to point to that same fact. Thus was Flora convinced that it was this unfortunate attachment, in which for a moment she had felt herself so supremely blessed, that was the source of her misfortunes. But then, how had Nisida discovered her secret? This was an enigma defying conjecture; for Francisco was too honorable to reveal his love to his sister, after having so earnestly enjoined Flora herself not to betray that secret. At times a gleam of hope would dawn in upon her soul, even through the massive walls of that living tomb to which she appeared to have been consigned. Would Francisco forget her? Oh, no! She felt certain that he would leave no measure untried to discover her fate, no means unessayed to effect her deliverance. But, alas! then would come the maddening thought that he might be deceived with regard to her real position, that the same enemy or enemies who had persecuted her might invent some specious tale to account for her absence, and deter him from persevering in his inquiries concerning her. Thus was the unhappy maiden a prey to a thousand conflicting sentiments, unable to settle her mind upon any conviction save the appalling one which made her feel the stern truth of her captivity. Oh! to be condemned so young to perpetual prisonage, was indeed hard, too hard, enough to make reason totter on its throne and paralyze the powers of even the strongest intellect. Sister Alba had sketched out to her the course of existence on which she must prepare to enter. 10 days of prayer and sorry food in her own cell were first enjoined as a preliminary, to be followed by admission into the number of penitents who lacerated their naked forms with scourges at the foot of the altar. Then the period of her penitence in this manner would be determined by the manifestations of contrition which she might evince, and which would be proved by the frequency of her self flagellations, the severity with which the scourge was applied, and the anxiety which she might express to become a member of the holy sisterhood. When the term of penitence should arrive, the maiden would be removed to the department of the convent inhabited by the professed nuns, and then her flowing hair would be cut short, and she would enter on her novitiate previously to taking the veil, that last step in the conventual regime, which would forever raise up an insuperable barrier between herself and the great, the beautiful, the glorious world without. Such was the picture spread for the contemplation of this charming but hapless maiden. Need we wonder if her glances recoiled from her prospects, as if from some loathsome spectre, or from a hideous serpent preparing to dart from its coils and twine its slimy folds around her? Nor was the place in which she was a prisoner calculated to dissipate her gloomy reflections. It seemed a vast cavern hollowed out of the bowels of the earth, rendered solid by masonry and divided into various compartments. No windows were there to admit the pure light of day. An artificial luster provided by lamps and tapers, prevailed eternally in that earthly purgatory. Sometimes the stillness of death, the solemn silence of the tomb reigned throughout that place. Then the awful tranquillity would be suddenly broken by the dreadful shrieks, the prayers, the lamentations, and the scourges of the penitents. The spectacle of these unfortunate creatures, with their naked forms writhing and bleeding beneath the self inflicted stripes, which they doubtless rendered as severe as possible in order to escape the sooner from that terrible preparation for their novitiate, this spectacle, we say, was so appalling to the contemplation of Flora, that she seldom quitted her own cell to set foot in the chamber of penitence. But there were times when her thoughts became so torturing, and the solitude of her stone chamber so terrible, that she was compelled to open the door and escape from those painful ideas and that hideous loneliness, even though the scene merely shifted to a reality from which her gentle spirit recoiled in horror and dismay. But circumstances soon gave her a companion in her cell; for on the second night of her abode in that place, the noise of the well known machinery was heard, the revolution of wheels and the play of the dreadful mechanism raised ominous echoes throughout the subterrane. Another victim came. All the cells were tenanted, and the newcomer was therefore lodged with Flora, whose own grief was partially forgotten, or at all events mitigated, in the truly Christian task of consoling a fellow sufferer. Thus it was that the Countess of Arestino and Flora Francatelli became companions in the Carmelite convent. At first the wretched Giulia gave way to her despair, and refused all comfort; but so gentle, so willing, so softly fascinating were the ways of the beautiful Flora, and so much sincerity did the charming girl manifest in her attempts to revive that frail but drooping flower which had been thrown as it were at the feet of her, pure though also drooping rosebud of innocence and beauty, so earnest did the maiden seem in her disinterested attentions, that Giulia yielded to the benign influence, and became comparatively composed. But mutual confidence, that outpouring of the soul's heavy secrets, which so much alleviates the distress of the female mind, did not spring up between the countess and Flora, because the former shrank from revealing the narrative of her frailty, and the latter chose not to impart her love for the young Count of Riverola. Nevertheless, the countess gave her companion to understand that she had friends without, who were acquainted with the fact of her removal to the Carmelite convent, and on whose fidelity as well as resolute valor she could reckon; for the promise made to her by the robber captain, and the idea that the Marquis of Orsini would not leave her to the dreadful fate of eternal seclusion in that place, flashed to her mind when the first access of despair had passed. Flora was delighted to hear that such a hope animated the Countess of Arestino, and throwing herself at her feet, she said,
"Oh, lady, shouldst thou have the power to save me "
"Thinkest thou that I would leave thee here in this horrible dungeon?"
interrupted the countess, raising Flora from her supplicant position on the cold pavement of the cell and embracing her.
"No, if those on whom I rely fulfill the hope that we have entertained, we shall go forth together. And oh," added the countess, "were all Florence to rise up against this accursed institution, pillage it, and sack it, and raze it to the ground, so that not one stone shall remain upon another, Heaven could not frown upon the deed; for surely demons in mortal shape must have invented that terrible engine by means of which I was consigned to this subterrane."
The recollection of the anguish which she had suffered during the descent, a mental agony that Flora herself could fully appreciate, she having passed through the same infernal ordeal, produced a cold shudder which oscillated throughout Giulia's entire form. But we shall not dwell upon this portion of our tale, for the reader is about to pass to scenes of so thrilling a nature, that all he has yet read in the preceding chapters are as nothing to the events which will occupy those that are to follow. We said, then, at the opening of this chapter, that 6 days had elapsed since Flora became an inmate of the convent, and 4 since circumstances had given her a companion in the person of Giulia of Arestino. It was on the 6th night, and the 2 inmates of the gloomy cell were preparing to retire to their humble pallet, after offering their prayers to the Virgin; for adversity had already taught the countess to pray, and to pray devoutly too, when they were startled and alarmed by the sudden clang of a large bell fixed in some part of the subterrane. The echoes which it raised, and the monotonous vibration of the air which it produced, struck terror to their souls. A minute elapsed, and again the bell struck. Flora and the countess exchanged glances of terror and mysterious doubt, so ominous was that sound. Again a minute passed, and a third time clanged that heavy iron tongue. Then commenced a funeral hymn, chanted by several female voices, and emanating as yet from a distance, sounding, too, as if the mournful melody was made within the very bowels of the earth. But by degrees the strain became louder, as those who sang approached nearer, and in a short time the sound of many light steps on the stone pavement of the chamber of penitence were heard by Giulia and her companion in their cell. Again did they exchange terrified glances, as if demanding of each other what this strange interruption of night silence could mean. But at that instant the hymn ceased, and again the loud bell clanged, as if in some far off gallery hollowed out of the earth. Oh! in that convent where all was mysterious, and where a terrific despotism obeyed the dictates of its own wild will, such sounds as that funeral chant, and that deafening bell, were but too fairly calculated to inspire the souls of the innocent Flora and the guilty Giulia with the wildest apprehension. Suddenly the door opened, and Sister Alba, who presided over the chamber of penitence, appeared on the threshold.
"Come forth, daughters," she exclaimed, "and behold the punishment due to female frailty."
The Countess of Arestino and Flora Francatelli mechanically obeyed this command, and a strange, a heart rending sight met their eyes. The chamber of penitence was filled with nuns in their convent garbs, and the penitents in a state of semi nudity. On one side of the apartment, a huge door with massive bolts and chains stood open, allowing a glimpse, by the glare of the lamps, tapers, and torches, of the interior of a small cell that looked like a sepulcher. Near the entrance to that tomb for such indeed it was stood the lady abbess, and on the pavement near her knelt a young and beautiful girl, with hands clasped and countenance raised in an agony of soul which no human pen can describe. The garments of this hapless being had been torn away from her neck and shoulders, doubtless by the force used to drag her thither; and her supplicant attitude, the despair that was depicted in her appearance, her extreme loveliness, and the wild glaring of her deep blue eyes, gave her the appearance of something unearthly in the glare of that vacillating light.
"No, daughter,"
said the abbess, in a cold, stern voice.
"There is no mercy for you on earth."
Then echoed throughout the chamber of penitence a scream, a shriek so wild, so long, so full of agony, had it penetrated to the hearts of Flora, the countess, and some of the penitents, although the abbess and her nuns seemed unmoved by that appalling evidence of female anguish. At the same instant the bell struck again, and the funeral hymn was recommenced by the junior recluses. Sister Alba now approached Flora and the countess, and said in a low whisper, "The vengeance of the conventual discipline is terrible on those who sin. That miserable girl completed her novitiate 5 months ago, and the night before she was to take the veil she escaped. This awful crime she committed for the sake of some man she had known ere she first entered the convent, and for whom she thus endangered her immortal soul. But her justly incensed relations yesterday discovered her retreat, and she was restored to this house of penitence and peace. Alas! the effects of her frailty were but too apparent, and that benighted girl will become a mother, had she long enough to live." These last words were uttered with terrible significancy, and the nun turned aside, leaving Flora and the countess each a prey to the most unspeakable horror. In the meantime, the hapless victim of ecclesiastical vengeance, the poor erring creature, who had dared and sacrificed everything for the love of her seducer, had risen from her supplicant posture, and flown wildly, madly round to the elder nuns in succession, imploring mercy, and rending the very roof of the subterrane with piercing screams. But those to whom she appealed turned a deaf ear, for a convent is a tomb in which all human sympathies are immured, a vortex wherein all the best feelings that concrete in the mortal heart are cruelly engulfed. And while this wretched girl, for she was scarcely yet a woman, although were life spared her on the way to maternity, was thus fruitlessly imploring the mercy of hearts that were stern and remorseless, the hymn continued, and the bell tolled at short intervals. Suddenly, at a particular verse in the funeral chant, the 3 nuns who usually did the bidding of the lady abbess, glided noiselessly, but surely, like black serpents, toward the victim, seized her in their powerful grasp, and bore her to the cell in which she was to be immured. The choir of nuns raised their voices, and the bell now clanged quickly with its almost deafening note, and those human and metallic sounds combined to deaden the screams that burst from the miserable girl, on whom the huge door at length closed with fearful din. The massive bolts were drawn, the key turned harshly in the lock, and still the shrieks came from within the sepulchre where a human being was entombed alive. So sickening a sensation came over Flora and the countess, when the last act of the awful tragedy was thus concluded, that they reeled back to their cell with brains so confused, and such horrible visions floating before their eyes, that their very senses appeared to be abandoning them. When they were enabled to collect their scattered ideas, and the incidents of the last half hour assumed a definite shape in their memories, the sound of hymn and bell had ceased, the chamber of penitence was deserted, the sound of death reigned throughout the subterrane, nor did even the faintest shriek or scream emanate from the cell in which the victim was entombed. Section 32 of Wagner the Wehr-Wolf by George W. M. Reynolds. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 31 The Banditti. The night of which we are speaking was destined to be the one pregnant with alarms for the Countess of Arestino and Signora Francatelli. Scarcely had they recovered from the effects of the appalling tragedy which had just been enacted, when their attention was drawn to a strange noise on one side of the cell. They listened, and the noise continued, resembling an attempt to remove the massive masonry at that part of the stone chamber.
"Merciful heavens!"
said Flora in a subdued whisper.
"What new terror can now be in store for us?"
But scarcely were these words uttered, when a considerable portion of the masonry fell in with a loud crash; and had not the countess and Flora already withdrawn to the vicinity of the door, when the mysterious sound first began, they would either have been killed or seriously hurt by the falling of the huge stones. A faint scream burst from Flora's lips, and she would have rushed from the cell, had not an ejaculation of joy escaped the countess. For at the aperture formed by the falling in of the masonry, and by the glare of the light that shone on the other side, as well as by the dim taper that burnt before the crucifix in the cell, Giulia had in an instant recognized the countenance of the Marquis of Orsini.
"Manuel, dearest Manuel!"
she exclaimed, rushing toward the aperture.
"Art thou come to save me?" "Yes, Giulia,"
replied the marquis.
But by what good fortune art thou the very first whom it is my destiny to encounter? And who is thy companion?"
"A good, a generous hearted girl, whom you must save also from this dreadful place,"
answered the countess.
"and as for this accidental, but most fortunate encounter, I can tell you no more than that this is our cell. It is rather for me to ask."
"We have no time to waste in idle talk, my lord," said Stephano, who now appeared at the aperture. "Pardon my roughness, noble lady, but every moment is precious. Is there any danger of an alarm being given?"
"None that I am aware of,"
returned the countess.
"The place where we now are must be 100 yards below the surface of the earth."
"No, my lady, that is impossible," interrupted Stephano. "100 feet at the most, and even that is above the mark. But stand back, my lady, while we remove some more of this solid masonry." Giulia obeyed the robber chief, and turned to embrace Flora with the liveliest manifestations of joy, which the young maiden sincerely shared, for escape now appeared to be at hand. The aperture was rapidly enlarged by those who worked on the other side, and in a few minutes it was spacious enough to admit the passage of a human form. Then Giulia and Flora quitted their dismal cell, and entered the innermost chamber of the robber's hold, but from which the treasures described in a previous chapter had all been removed away. Giulia embraced the marquis with grateful affection, but Stephano exclaimed, "Come, my lord, remember your oath, and join us in this expedition to the end." At that moment the awful tragedy of the night flashed back to Flora's memory, from which nothing could have dispelled it even for an instant, save the thrilling excitement attendant on the escape from the convent, and in a few hurried words she told the dreadful tale. But what was the astonishment of all present, when Piero, one of the banditti, exclaimed in a tone of mingled rage and grief, "'Tis Carlotta! The victim can be none other. The dates you have mentioned, signora, convince me. Yes, 5 months ago she fled from that accursed convent, and yesterday she disappeared. Ah! my poor Carlotta!" And the rude but handsome brigand wept. Flora, forgetting the danger of re entering the walls of the terrible institution, exclaimed,
"Follow me it may not be too late. I will show you the cell."
And she once more passed through the aperture, closely followed by Stephano, Piero, Lomellino, and a dozen other banditti. The Marquis of Orsini stayed behind a few moments, to breathe a reassuring word to Giulia, whom he left in the treasure chamber as that apartment of the robber's hold was called and then hastened after those who had penetrated into the subterrane of the convent. The party entered the chamber of penitence, where the long wax candles were still burning before the altar, and Flora having hastily given Stephano as much information as she could relative to the geography of the place, that chieftain placed sentinels around. Flora had already pointed out the door of the dungeon to which Carlotta had been consigned, and Piero hastened to call upon his mistress to answer him. It was a touching spectacle to behold that lawless and bold bad man melting into tenderness beneath the influence of love. But no reply came from within that dungeon, and though the bolts were easily drawn back, yet the lock was strong and the key was not there. By this time the penitents, who slept in the various cells adjoining the chamber, had become alarmed by the heavy tread and the voices of men, and had opened their doors; but they were desired to keep back by the sentinels, whom Stephano had posted around to maintain order and prevent a premature alarm, but who, nevertheless, gave assurances of speedy escape to those who might choose to profit by the opportunity. Suddenly a door, which Flora had never noticed before in the chamber of penitence, opened, and two recluses appeared on the threshold.
"The abbess!"
exclaimed Flora, yielding to a sudden impulse of alarm. But almost at the same instant Stephano sprung forward, caught the abbess by the arm, and dragged her into the chamber; then rushing up a flight of narrow stone steps, with which that door communicated, and which the other recluse had already turned to ascend, he brought her forcibly back also. This latter nun was Sister Alba, the presiding authority of the chamber of penitence. Her astonishment as well as that of the lady abbess, at the spectacle of a number of armed men in the most private part of the entire establishment, may well be conceived. Nor was this disagreeable surprise unmixed with intense alarm; but they had little time for reflection. "The key of that door!" cried Stephano in a fierce and menacing tone, as he pointed toward Carlotta's dungeon. The abbess mechanically drew forth the key from beneath her convent habit, and Piero, rushing forward, clutched it eagerly. In a few moments it turned in the lock the next moment the door stood open. But what a spectacle met the view of Piero, Flora, and those who were near enough to glance within! Stretched upon the stone floor of the narrow cell lay the victim, motionless and still. Drops of gore hung to her lips; in an agony of grief she had burst a blood vessel, and death must have been almost instantaneous. Flora staggered back, sick at the dreadful sight, and she would have fallen to the ground had not the Marquis of Orsini suddenly sprung forward to sustain her.
"This is no place for you, young lady," he said. "Permit me to conduct you back to the companionship of the Countess of Arestino."
Flora leant upon his arm, and he half carried rather than led her away from the chamber of penitence into the robber's hold. But as they passed through the aperture formed by the removal of the masonry, a terrible menace met their ears. "Vengeance!" cried Piero, furiously. "Vengeance on the murderess of Carlotta!"
"Yes, vengeance shalt thou have, comrade,"
returned the deep, sonorous voice of Stephano. But scarcely were those words uttered, when the loud clanging of the bells struck up, and the abbess exclaimed joyfully, "We are saved! We are saved!" Section 33 of Wagner the Wehr-Wolf by George W. M. Reynolds. Chapter 32 The Mystery of the Chair The Catastrophe. The reader will recollect that when Flora Francatelli was released from the chair at the bottom of the pit or well, Sister Alba had led her along a narrow, dark passage communicating with the chamber of penitence. In a small dome like cavity, hollowed out of the roof of this passage, hung a large bell, and in a cell opening from the side of the passage immediately beneath the dome dwelt an old nun, who, for some dreadful misdeed committed in her youth, had voluntarily consigned herself to the convent of the Carmelites, and, having passed through the ordeal of the chamber of penitence, had accepted the office of sextoness in that department of the establishment. It was her duty to keep the chamber of penitence clean, maintain tapers constantly burning before the altar, supply also the cells of the penitents themselves with lights, and toll the bell whenever occasion required. She it was who had visited Flora's cell in the first night of her arrival at the convent, to renew the taper that burnt before her crucifix, and to exchange the maiden's attire for the conventual garb. This old nun it was, then, who suddenly tolled the bell, at the moment when Piero and Stephano were menacing the abbess and Sister Alba with their vengeance, and when the Marquis of Orsini was bearing away Flora to the robber's hold, that she might have the companionship of Giulia. The way in which the old nun rang the bell was such that the inmates of the convent would perceive it to be an alarm; and moreover, so sudden was its startling clang, that Stephano and Piero abandoned their hold upon the abbess and Sister Alba, and retreated a few paces, uncertain how to act. Hence the exclamation of the superior of the convent, "We are saved! We are saved!" But little did that stern, imperious woman know of the desperate characters of those with whom she had now to deal. Ashamed of their momentary hesitation, Stephano and Piero rushed on the abbess and Sister Alba, and dragged them, in spite of their deafening screams, into that fatal cell, where they threw them headlong over the lifeless corpse of their victim. Scarcely, however, had they closed the door on the wretched woman, when the Marquis of Orsini returned, and too well divining what had passed, he exclaimed,
"In the name of Heaven, captain, by all that is holy, Piero, I implore you not to consummate this dreadful crime."
"My lord," said Stephano, "ere we entered on this expedition to night, you bound yourself by an oath to obey me as the leader. I command you then not to interfere with our proceedings, but, on the contrary, go and ascertain whence comes the clanging of that infernal bell." The marquis turned aside, sick at heart at the deed of vengeance which was in progress, but unable to remonstrate further, in consequence of the oath which he had taken. It was, however, a relief for him to move away from the vicinity of the living tomb, whence emanated the shrieks of the abbess and the nun, and guided by the sound of the bell, he rushed, with whirling brain and desperate resolution, into the passage leading from the chamber of penitence. In a few moments the clanging of the bell ceased, for the marquis had discovered the old sextoness in her cell, and compelled her to desist. All the events yet recorded in the preceding and the present chapter had occurred with a rapidity which the reader can scarcely comprehend, because their complicated nature and variety have forced us to enter into minute details requiring a considerable time to pursue. Those events which we are now about to describe also succeeded each other with marvelous speed, and occupied an incredibly short space of time, although our narrative must necessarily appear prolix in comparison. Extraordinary was the excitement that now prevailed in all the subterranean department of the convent. The victims of a stern but just vengeance were sending forth appalling screams from the fatal dungeon, and some of the penitents in their cells, which were still guarded by the sentinels, were also giving vent to their affright by means of piercing shrieks, though others remained tranquil in hope of the promised release. Stephano had entirely recovered his presence of mind, and now issued his orders with wondrous rapidity. Pointing to the door by which the abbess and Sister Alba had entered the chamber of penitence, he said:
"Lomellino, that is the way to the upper part of the convent, there can be no doubt of it. Take Piero and half a dozen of the men, and hasten up that staircase. Secure the front gate of the building, and possess yourself of the plate and treasure. But no violence, remember no violence to the nuns."
Lomellino, Piero, and 6 of the banditti hastened to obey these commands, while Stephano remained below to act as circumstances might require. He went the round of the 5 cells belonging to the penitents, and enjoined those who were yielding to their terrors to hold their peace, as they had nothing to fear, but much to gain, at least, he observed, if they valued their freedom; and to those who were tranquil he repeated the assurances of speedy liberation already given by his men. For 30 years the old woman had not seen a being of the male sex, and she was terrified by the appearance of an armed man in that place which she had so long deemed sacred against the possibility of such an intrusion.
"Fear nothing," said the marquis. "No one will harm you. But what will be the effect of that alarm which you have rung?"
"Merely to warn those above that something unusual is taking place below," answered the old woman.
"And by what means can access be obtained to this subterrane?"
demanded the marquis. "There is a staircase leading from the chamber of penitence up into the hall of the convent."
"Of the existence of that staircase I am aware,"
interrupted the marquis, who had seen the abbess and Sister Alba enter the chamber of penitence a few minutes previously, as stated in the preceding chapter.
"but there are no means of ingress or egress."
"Yes, follow me," said the sextoness. Taking up a lamp from the table in her cell, she led the way to the further end of the passage, threw open a door, and thrusting forth the light beyond the opening, exclaimed in a tone denoting a reminiscence the bitterness of which long years had scarcely mitigated, "There is the road whereby I came hither, and many others have traveled the same downward path." The marquis seized the lamp and beheld a few paces from him a wicker chair, to which 2 ropes hanging perpendicularly down were fastened. He raised his eyes, following the direction of the ropes, but as there was now no other light in the pit than the feeble, flickering one shed by the lamp which he held, his glances could not penetrate the dense obscurity that prevailed above.
"What means this chair with its 2 ropes? And for what purpose is this narrow square compartment, the mouth of which is shrouded in darkness?"
inquired Manuel. "This is the method of descent to this region for all those who come to this convent either as willing penitents, or who are sent hither against their inclination," returned the sextoness. "And though I came a willing penitent, yet never, while the breath shall animate this poor weak form, and reason shall remain, can I forget the mental agony, the intense anguish, of that fearful descent. Ah! it is a cruel engine of torture, although it tears not the flesh, nor racks the limbs, nor dislocates the joints. And even though 30 long years have passed since I made that dread journey," she continued, glancing upwards, "30 years since I last saw the light of day, and though I have since learned and seen how much of the horror of that descent is produced by the delusion of mechanical ingenuity, yet still I shudder, and my blood runs cold within me."
"To me, old woman," said the marquis, "your words are an enigma; but you have excited my curiosity. Speak quickly, and explain yourself, for I may not linger here."
"Behold this basket," returned the nun, without further preface. "These ropes connect it with complicated machinery in some chamber adjoining the well itself. In that basket those who are doomed to pass the ordeal of penitence are lowered from an apartment above. This apartment is really but a short distance overhead, but the act of the mechanist has so contrived the 4 wooden walls of the well, that when the descent of the basket ceases,
Those walls rise slowly upward, and thus descent appears to be continued. Then, when the affrighted female stretched forth her hands wildly, she encounters the ascending walls, and she believes that she is still going down, down, down. Oh, signor, it is most horrible, but a fitting prelude to the terrors of that place." And she pointed back toward the chamber of penitence. The marquis was about to make some observation in reply to the strange disclosures of the old sextoness, when suddenly the din of a tumult, occurring, as it seemed, in that department of the convent far overhead, reached his ears, commencing with the rushing of many feet, the ejaculations of hostile bands, and then continuing with the clash of arms and the shrieks of a frightened woman, until, in a few moments, those ominous sounds were broken in upon and dominated by the wild terrific cry of "Fire! Fire!"
"Oh, wherefore have I tarried here so long?"
exclaimed the marquis; and he was about to return to the chamber of penitence, when a sudden blaze of light appeared at the mouth of the pit 30 yards above. Looking hastily up, he beheld the flames rolling over the entrance of that well at the bottom of which he stood; and, in another minute, the forked fire burst from the sides, forcing for itself a way through the wooden walls, and the old dry timber and planks yielded to the devouring element as if they had been steeped in oil. But while the marquis was still standing at the bottom looking up the pit, the clash of weapons, the tread of many steps, and the vociferations of combatants appeared to grow nearer. Then, in another moment, he became aware that the hostile sounds came down the well, and proceeded from the room far above, where the fire as well as the war was raging. Manuel had again turned around to hurry back to the chamber of penitence, when a loud cry of despair came vibrating down, and in another instant the heavy form of the man was precipitated into the well. The wicker chair fortunately broke his fall, and he rose with a dreadful imprecation.
"Piero!"
cried the marquis. "Ah, my lord, is it you?" said the bandit faintly, as he staggered back and fell heavily on the floor. "This is a bad business. The sbirri were alarmed, and broke in. Lomellino has got away, but the rest who were with me are slain." "And you are wounded, Piero!" ejaculated the marquis, rushing forward to assist the bandit, from whose breast he now perceived the blood to be flowing. "Never mind me, my lord," said Piero faintly. "Haste and tell Verrina that our men fought well. It was not their fault, nor mine. The nuns must have given the alarm." His voice had grown fainter as he spoke; and, while the marquis was endeavoring to raise him, he fell back again, and expired with the name of Carlotta upon his tongue. The combat had ceased above, but the flames had increased in the well to such an extent that the marquis was compelled to beat a rapid retreat toward the chamber of penitence, whither the old sextoness had already fled. At the entrance of that apartment he met Stephano, who, alarmed by the clashing of arms and the cries of "Fire" that had reached his ears, and which seemed to come from the direction of the passage, was hurrying thither to learn the cause. In a few words the marquis informed him of all that had occurred.
"Back to the cavern, my friends!"
cried Stephano, in a loud tone.
"If the sbirri discover us there, we will resist them to the death."
And followed by the marquis and 2 or 3 of his men, the captain passed through the aperture made from the cell recently occupied by Flora and the countess, into the treasure chamber. But scarcely had those few individuals effected their retreat in this manner, when a tremendous crash was heard. Cries and shrieks of horror and dismay burst from those who had not as yet passed through the opening, and then the roof of the chamber of penitence and all the adjacent cells gave way with a din as of 1,000 cannon, burying beneath their weight the sextoness, the 5 penitents, the inmates of Carlotta's cell, and 7 of the banditti. Those who were in the treasure chamber felt the ground shake beneath their feet. The sides, although hollowed from the solid rock, appeared to vibrate and groan, and the aperture leading into the subterrane of the convent was closed up by the massive masonry that had fallen in. Flora and Giulia threw themselves into each other's arms, weeping bitterly, for they saw how dearly their freedom had been purchased, and they trembled for the result. But the Marquis of Orsini, although greatly shocked at the terrible sacrifice of human life which had occurred, exerted himself to console and reassure the 2 terrified ladies. Section 34 of Wagner the Wehr-Wolf by George W. M. Reynolds. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 33.
Lomellino's escape. Stephano's intentions. Stefano Verrina was not the man to allow his energies to be paralyzed by the reverse he had just sustained. He immediately commanded a general muster of his men to be held in the banqueting hall, that he might accurately ascertain the loss his cause had sustained. Giulia and Flora were left in the treasure chamber to snatch a few hours' repose, if they could, as it was now past 2 o'clock in the morning, and the marquis accompanied Stephano to the banqueting hall. Scarcely were the men mustered, when the usual signals announcing the approach of a member of the band were heard, and in a few moments Lomellino appeared amongst the troop. All crowded round him to hear the account which he had to give of his expedition and its failure. His tale was soon told. It seemed that on reaching what might be properly termed the main building of the convent, he found the greatest alarm and confusion prevailing amongst the nuns, the shrieks of the abbess, Sister Alba, and the penitents, and the alarm of the bell, having reached the ears of the recluses. Their consternation was increased almost to madness when they suddenly perceived several armed men emerging from the private staircase leading to the subterranean department, and Lomellino found it impossible to tranquilize them either by threats or fair speaking. A guard of sbirri must have been passing at the time, for loud knocks resounded at the gate, which the old porteress immediately opened before Lomellino or any of his men could interfere to prevent her. A number of police officers rushed in, and then commenced a terrific combat between the banditti and the sbirri, the former of whom were forced into an apartment, the door of which was originally locked, but was burst open in the deadly struggle. There the strife was continued, when suddenly the cry of fire arose, and the flames, which had caught a bed in the apartment, spread rapidly to the cumbrous and time worn woodwork that supported the ceiling. How the fire originated, Lomellino knew not; but as some of the nuns carried lamps in their hands, and rushed wildly about in all directions in their terror, it was not very difficult to hazard a conjecture as to the cause of the conflagration. From that apartment, where the fire began, the flames drove the combatants into an inner room, and there Lomellino saw his comrade Piero hurled down some steep place, he himself being too sorely pressed by his assailants to be able to repair to his assistance. At length, seeing that all his companions were slain, Lomellino had fought his way desperately through the police officers, and had succeeded in escaping from the convent, though closely pursued by 3 of the sbirri. They were rapidly gaining upon him, when an awful crash suddenly met their ears, as they were hurrying along the street leading to the wood; and looking back, Lomellino beheld a tremendous pillar of flame shoot up from the place where the convent had stood, to the very sky, rendering for the space of a minute everything as light as day around. The building had fallen in, and Heaven only knows how many of the nuns and sbirri had escaped, or how many had perished beneath the ruins. Those officers who were in pursuit of Lomellino were so astonished by the sudden din and the column of flame, that they remained rooted to the spot where they had turned to gaze on the evidence of the catastrophe, and Lomellino had succeeded in effecting a safe and unobserved return to the stronghold. This account was particularly welcome to the robbers, inasmuch as it convinced them that the sbirri had no clue to the secret entrance of their stronghold, and that none of their band had been captured in the conflict, for they would rather hear of the death of their comrades than that they had been taken prisoners, because, were the latter the case, the tortures of the rack or the exhortations of the priest might elicit confessions hostile to the interests of the cause. Stephano Verrina now proceeded to count his men, who had mustered 50 strong previously to the expedition of that fatal night, which, it was ascertained, had reduced the number to 36. 7, including Piero, had been slain by the sbirri, and as many having perished by the falling in of the chamber of penitence. The captain then addressed the troop in the following manner: "Worthy comrades, our number is sadly reduced, but regrets will not bring back those gallant fellows who are gone. It, therefore, behooves us to attend to our own interests; and, for that purpose, I demand your attention for a few minutes. In pursuance of the resolution to which we came the night before last at the general council that was held, the treasures and possessions amassed during many years of adventure and peril have been fairly divided, and each man's portion has been settled by lot. The 14 shares that revert to us by the death of our comrades shall be equally subdivided to morrow, and the superintendence of that duty, my friends, will be the last act in my chieftainship. Yes, brave comrades, I shall then leave you, in accordance with the announcement I made the night before last. It will grieve me to part with you,
but you will choose another captain." "Lomellino! Lomellino!" exclaimed the banditti with one accord. "He shall succeed our gallant Verrina." "And you could not make a better choice," continued Stephano. "Lomellino!"
"Pardon me, captain,"
interrupted the individual thus alluded to.
"but is not that little expedition to take place on Monday, in case the lady requires it? We have received her gold as an earnest."
"And double that amount was promised if the affair should turn out successful," added Stephano. "But I have reasons of my own, which you may perhaps understand, Lomellino, for desiring that all idea of that business should be abounded; and in order that the band may not be losers by this change of intentions, I will give you from my own share of our long accumulated treasures." "No, no," cried the banditti, enthusiastically; "we will not receive our gallant Stephano's gold. Let him act according to his own wishes." "I thank you, my friends, for this generosity on your part," said Stephano. Their meeting then broke up, and the robbers sat down to the banqueting table, to luxuriate in the rich wines with which the stronghold was well stored. The Marquis of Orsini was compelled, through fear of giving offense, to share in the festival.
"This resolution to abandon the command of your gallant band is somewhat sudden, meseems, Signor Stephano,"
he said, for not having been present at the council 2 nights previously, he was unaware of the captain's intention until it was alluded to in that individual's speech on the present occasion. "Yes, my lord," was the reply. "The resolution is sudden; but," he added, sinking his voice to a whisper, "a certain little blind god is at the bottom of it."
"Ah, signor, you are in love,"
said the marquis, laughing. "And therefore I mean to turn honest man," observed Verrina, also laughing. "In truth, I am not sorry to have found a good excuse to quit a mode of life which the headsman yearns to cut short. Not that I reck for peril; but, methinks, 20 years of danger and adventure ought to be succeeded by a season of tranquillity."
"Love has a marvelous influence over you, Signor Verrina,"
said the marquis.
"for love alone could have inspired such sentiments in your breast."
"I am fain to confess that your lordship is not far wrong," returned the bandit. "I have discovered a woman who is worthy of me, although she may not consider me to be altogether deserving of her. But of that no matter, for I am not accustomed to consult the inclinations of others, when mine own are concerned. And now a word in respect to yourself, my lord. When do you propose to quit this place? For according to my promise, you are now the master of your own actions."
"The mysterious assault made upon the convent, the destruction of the entire establishment, and the lives that have been lost, will doubtless create a terrible sensation in Florence,"
replied the nobleman.
"and should it transpire that I was in any way implicated "
"That is impossible, my lord," interrupted Stephano. "These men whom you behold around you could alone betray that secret; and you must have seen enough of them "
"To know that they are staunch and true,"
added the marquis.
"Yes, on reflection, I perceive that I have nothing to fear; and therefore, with your leave, the countess, her young companion, and myself will take our departure to morrow."
"In the evening, when it is dusk," said Stephano. "But your lordship will not remain in Florence?"
"The news which you brought me, a few days ago, of the arrest of that poor Israelite on a ridiculous but most monstrous charge, has affected me strangely,"
observed Manuel.
"and as it is in my power to explain away that charge, I must tarry in Florence the necessary time to accomplish this object. The Count of Arestino will imagine that his wife has perished in the ruins of the convent, and hence her temporary concealment in the city will be easily effected."
"Well, my lord," said Stephano, "it is not for me to dictate nor to advise; but as I always entertain an esteem for a man with whom I have measured weapons, and as I have somehow formed a liking for your lordship pardon my boldness I should recommend you not to remain in Florence on account of the Jew. The Lady Giulia might be discovered by her husband, and you would lose her again. To tell your lordship the truth," he added, in a low and confidential tone, "a friend of mine, who commands a trading vessel, sails in a few days from Leghorn for the Levant; and I intend to be a passenger on board, in company with a sweet lady whom I have honored with my affections. What says your lordship? Will it suit you to embark in that vessel?"
"A thousand thanks, Signor Verrina,"
replied the marquis.
"but I must remain at Florence to prove the innocence of that poor persecuted Jew."
Stephano offered no further remonstrance, and the conversation which ensued possessed not the least interest for our readers. On the following evening the marquis, Giulia, and Flora quitted the robbers' stronghold. All three were carefully blindfolded, and safely conducted amidst the dangers of the egress by Stephano, Lomellino, and another bandit. When in the grove with which the entrance of the stronghold communicated, the bandages were removed from their eyes, and the two ladies, as well as the marquis, were once more enabled to rejoice in their freedom. According to a previous arrangement between them, and in consequence of the intention of the marquis to remain a few days in Florence, Giulia accompanied Flora to the dwelling of the young maiden's aunt, who was rejoiced to behold the reappearance of her niece, and who willingly afforded an asylum to the countess. The marquis, having conducted the two ladies to the hospitable cottage of this good woman, returned to his own dwelling, his protracted absence from which had caused serious apprehensions amongst the few domestics whom his means permitted him to maintain. Ere we conclude this chapter, we shall observe in a few words that the greatest excitement prevailed in Florence relative to the attack on the convent and its destruction. Many of the nuns had escaped from the building at the commencement of the fire, and these took up their abode in another institution of the same order. But the thrilling events which occurred in the chamber of penitence did not transpire, nor was it ascertained who were the sacrilegious invaders of the establishment, nor by what means they had obtained an entry. Section 34.
Section 35 of Wagner the Wehr-Wolf by George W. M. Reynolds. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 34. The Abduction. It was originally Stephano Verrina's intention to observe good faith with Nisida in respect to the service on which she had intimated her desire to employ him and his band; but so dazzled was he by her almost supernatural majesty of beauty on that night when he and his companions encountered her in the Riverola Palace, that he would have promised, or indeed undertaken, anything calculated to please or benefit her. When, however, he came to reflect calmly upon the service in which Nisida had enlisted him, he began to suspect that some motive more powerful than the mere desire to effect the liberation of an innocent man influenced that lady. Had she not put to death the beautiful creature who had resided in the same dwelling with Fernand Wagner? And did not that deed bear upon its aspect the stamp of an Italian woman's vengeance? Thus thought Stephano, and he soon arrived at the very natural conclusion that Nisida loved Fernand Wagner. Wagner was therefore his rival, and Verrina did not consider it at all in accordance with his own particular views in respect to Nisida to aid in effecting that rival's liberation, should he be condemned by the tribunal. Again, Stephano reflected that as Wagner's acquittal was within the range of probability, it would be expedient to possess himself of Nisida before the trial took place; and what opportunity could be more favorable than the one which the lady herself afforded by the appointment she had given him for the Sunday evening at the gate of St. Mary's Cathedral? All these considerations had determined the bandit to adopt speedy and strenuous measures to possess himself of Nisida, of whom he was so madly enamored that the hope of gratifying his passion predominated even over the pride and delight he had hitherto experienced in commanding the Florentine robbers. The appointed evening came, and Stephano, disguised in his black mask, repaired a few minutes before 10 to the immediate vicinity of the old cathedral. At the corner of an adjacent street, two men, mounted on powerful horses, and holding a third steed by the bridle, were in readiness; and crouched in the black darkness formed by the shade of a huge buttress of the cathedral, two members of the troop which Lomellino now commanded lay concealed, for the new captain of banditti had lent some of his staunchest fellows to further the designs of the ex chieftain. A heavy rain had fallen in the early part of the day, but it ceased ere the sun went down, and the stars shone forth like beauty's eyes when the tears of grief have been wiped away by the lips of the lover. Stephano paced the arena in front of the sacred edifice, and at length a gentle tread and a rustling of velvet met his ears. Then in a few moments, as if emerging from the darkness, the majestic form of Nisida appeared, and when Stephano approached her, she drew aside her veil for an instant only for a single instant that he might convince himself of her identity with the lady of whom he was waiting. But as the light of the silver stars beamed for a moment on the countenance of Nisida, that mild and placid luster was outvied by the dazzling brilliancy of her large black eyes, and mental excitement had imparted a rich carnation hue to her cheek, rendering her so surpassingly beautiful that Stephano could almost have fallen on his knees to worship and adore her. But oh, what lovely skins do some snakes wear, and into what charming shapes does Satan often get! Nisida had replaced her veil while yet Verrina's eyes were fixed on her bewitching countenance; then, placing her finger lightly upon his arm oh, how that gentle touch thrilled through him!
She made a sign for him to follow her toward a niche in the deep gateway of the cathedral, for in that niche was an image of the Madonna, and before it burned a lamp night and day. To gain that spot it was necessary to pass the buttress in whose shade the two banditti lay concealed. Stephano trembled as he followed that lady whom he knew to be as intrepid, bold, and desperate as she was beautiful. He trembled, perhaps for the first time in his life, because never until now had he felt himself overawed by the majesty of loveliness and the resolute mind of a woman. But he had gone too far to retreat, even if that temporary and almost unaccountable timidity had prompted him to abandon his present design. Yes, he had gone too far, for at that moment when Nisida was passing the huge buttress, the two brigands sprung forth, and though her hands instantly grasped her dagger, yet so suddenly and effectually was she overpowered that she had not even time to draw it from its sheath. Fortunately the scheme of Stephano, the great square in front of the cathedral, was at that moment completely deserted by the usual evening loungers, and thus did he and his companions experience not the slightest interruption as they bore Nisida firmly and rapidly along to the corner of the street where the horses were in attendance. The lady's hands were already bound, and her dagger had been taken from her, and thus the resistance she was enabled to make was very slight, when Stephano, having sprung upon one of the horses, received the charming burden from the banditti, and embraced that fine voluptuous form in his powerful arms. The two men who had waited with Stephano's horse were already mounted on their own, as before stated, and the little party was now in readiness to start. "No further commands, signor?" said one of the banditti who had first seized upon Nisida. "None, my brave fellow. Tell Lomellino that I sent him my best wishes for his prosperity. And now for a rapid journey to Leghorn. Good night, signor. Good night. Farewell, farewell, my friends!" cried Verrina, and clapping spurs to his steed, he struck into a quick gallop, his two mounted companions keeping pace with him, and riding one on either side, so as to prevent any possibility of escape on the part of Donna Nisida of Riverola. In a few minutes the little party gained the bank of the Arno, along which they pursued their rapid way, lighted by the lovely moon, which now broke forth from the purple sky, and seemed, with its chaste beams playing on the surface of the water, to put a soul into the very river as it ran. Section 36 of Wagner the Wehr-Wolf by George W. M. Reynolds. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 35 Wagner and the Tempter Phantasmagoria. While Stephano was bearing away the Lady Nisida in the manner described in the preceding chapter, Fernand Wagner was pacing his solitary cell, conjecturing what would be the result of the morrow's trial. Nisida had visited him a second time on the preceding evening, disguised, as on the former occasion, in male attire, and she had implored him, in the language of the deaf and dumb, but far more eloquently with her speaking eyes, and the expression of her beauteous countenance, to allow measures to be that night adopted to effect his immediate escape. But he had resolutely persisted in his original determination to undergo his trial; for by pursuing this course, he stood the chance of an acquittal, and he knew on the other hand that if he were sentenced to die, the decree of the human tribunal could not be carried into execution. How his escape from that fate, should death be immediately ordained, was beyond his power of comprehension, but that he possessed a superhuman protector he knew full well. Without revealing to Nisida his motives for meeting the criminal judges, he refused to yield to her silently but eloquently pleaded prayer that he would escape should gold induce the jailers to throw open the door of his cell; but he conveyed to her the assurance that the deep interest she manifested in his behalf only bound him the more sincerely and devotedly to her. During 8 or 9 days of his imprisonment, he had reflected deeply upon the murder of Agnes. He naturally associated that black deed with the mystery of the strange lady who had so alarmed Agnes on several occasions; and he had of course been struck by the likeness of his much loved Nisida to her whom his dead granddaughter had so minutely described to him. But, if ever suspicion pointed toward Nisida as the murderess of Agnes, he closed his eyes upon the bare idea he hurled it from him and he rather fell back upon the unsatisfactory belief that the entire case was wrapped in a profound mystery than entertain a thought so injurious to her whom he loved so tenderly. We said that Nisida had visited him on Saturday night.
She determined to essay her powers of mute persuasion once more ere she finally arranged with the bandit for his rescue. But that arrangement was not to take place; for on the Sabbath evening she was carried away, in the manner already described. It was now, also, on that Sabbath evening that Wagner was pacing his dungeon, pondering on the probable result of his trial, and yet never ceasing to think of Nisida. His memory re traveled all the windings, the wanderings, the ways which his feet had trodden during a long, long life, and paused to dwell upon that far back hour when he loved the maiden who became the wife of his first period of youth, for he was now in a second period of youth, and he felt that he did not love her so devotedly, so tenderly, so passionately as he loved Nisida now. Suddenly, as he paced his dungeon and pondered on the past as well as on the present, the lamp flickered, and, before he could replenish it with oil, the wick died in its socket. He had the means of procuring another light, but he cared not to avail himself thereof; and he was about to lay aside his vesture, preparatory to seeking his humble pallet, when he was struck by the appearance of a dim and misty luster which seemed to emanate from the wall facing the door. He was not alarmed: he had seen and passed through too much in this world to be readily terrified; but he stood gazing, with intense curiosity and profound astonishment, upon that phenomenon for which his imagination suggested no natural cause. Gradually the luster became more powerful; but in the midst of it there appeared a dark cloud, which by degrees assumed the appearance of a human form, and in a few minutes Wagner beheld a tall, strange looking figure standing before him. But assuredly that was no mortal being; for, apart from the mysterious mode in which he had introduced himself into the dungeon, there was on his countenance so withering, bitter, scornful, sardonic a smile, that never did human face wear so sinister an expression. And yet this being wore a human shape, and was attired in the habiliments of that age the long doublet, the tight hose, the trunk breeches, the short cloak, and the laced collar. But his slouched hat, instead of having a large and gracefully waving plume, was decorated with but a single feather. Fernand stood with fascinated gaze upon the being whose eyes seemed to glare with subdued lightnings, like those of the basilisk. There was something awful in that form something wildly and menacingly sinister in that sardonic smile that curled his lips as if with ineffable contempt, and with the consciousness of his own power. "Wagner," he said, at length breaking the silence, and speaking in a deep sonorous voice, which reverberated even in that narrow dungeon like the solemn tone of the organ echoing amidst cloistral roofs, "Wagner, knowest thou who the being is that now addresseth thee?"
"I can conjecture," answered Fernand boldly. "Thou art the power of darkness."
"So men call me," returned the demon, with a scornful laugh. "Yes, I am he whose delight it is to spread desolation over a fertile and beautiful earth he, whose eternal enmity against man is the fruitful source of so much evil. But of all the disciples who have ever yet aided me in my hostile designs on the human race, none was so serviceable as Faust, that Count of Aurana, whose portrait thou hast so well delineated, and which now graces the wall of thy late dwelling."
"Would that I had never known him!"
ejaculated Wagner fervently. "On the contrary," resumed the demon, "thou shouldst be thankful that in the wild wanderings of his latter years he stopped at thy humble cottage in the Black Forest of Germany. Important to thee were the results of that visit, and still more important may they become."
"Explain thyself, fiend!"
said Wagner, nothing dismayed. "Thou wast tottering with age, hovering on the brink of the tomb, suspended to a thread which the finger of a child might have snapped," continued the demon; "and in one short hour thou wast restored to youth, vigor, and beauty."
"And by how dreadful a penalty was that renovated existence purchased!"
exclaimed Wagner. "Hast thou not been taught by experience that no human happiness can be complete that worldly felicity must ever contain within itself some element of misery and distress?" demanded the fiend. "Reflect, and be just. Thou art once more young, and thy tenure of life will last until that age at which thou wouldst have perished, had no supernatural power intervened to grant thee a new lease of experience. Nor is a long life the only boon conferred upon thee hitherto. Boundless wealth is ever at thy command,
The floor of this dungeon would be strewed with gold and jewels and precious stones, at thy bidding, as thou well knowest. Moreover, thou wast ignorant, illiterate, uninformed: now all the sources of knowledge, all the springs of learning, all the fountains of science and art, are at thy disposal, and with whose waters thou canst slake the thirst of thine intellect, endowed with a youthfulness and a vigor of form that will yield not to the weight of years, that will defy the pressure of time, and that no malady can impair; possessed of wealth having no limit, and enriched with a mind so stored with knowledge that the greatest sage is as a child in comparison with thee, how darest thou complain or repent of the compact which has given to thee all these, though associated with the destiny of a Wehr Wolf?"
It is of this fatal, this terrible destiny that I complain and that I repent,"
answered Wagner.
"Still do I admit that the advantages which I have obtained by embracing that destiny are great."
"And may be far greater,"
added the demon, impressively.
"Handsome, intelligent, and rich all that thou dost require is power."
"Yes,"
exclaimed Wagner, eagerly, and now manifesting, for the first time since the appearance of the fiend in his cell, any particular emotion.
"I have need of power power to avert those evils into which my sad destiny may plunge me power to dominate instead of being subject to the opinions of mankind power to prove my complete innocence of this dreadful crime now imputed to me power to maintain an untarnished reputation to which I cling most lovingly power to,"
he added, in a slower and also a more subdued tone,
"power to restore the lost faculties of hearing and speech to whom I love."
Strange was the smile that curled the demon's lips as Wagner breathed these last words.
"You require power power almost without limit,"
said the fiend, after a few moments' pause.
"and that aim is within thy reach handsome, intelligent, and rich,"
he continued, dwelling on each word with marked emphasis.
"and how happy mayst thou be when possessed of the power to render available, in all their glorious extent, the gifts, the qualities wherewith thou art already endowed, when in the service of Faust, during those 18 months which expired at the hour of sunset on the 30th of July, 1517.
"Alas!"
cried Wagner, his countenance expressing emotions of indescribable horror.
"Remind me not of that man's fate. Oh, never, never can I forget the mental agony, the profound and soul felt anguish which he experienced, and which he strove not to conceal, when at the gate of Vienna on that evening he bade me farewell forever."
"But thou wast happy supremely happy in his service,"
said the demon.
"and thou didst enjoy a fair opportunity of appreciating the value of the power which he possessed. By his superhuman aid wast thou transported from clime to clime, as rapidly as thought is transfused by the interchange of lovers' glances; and in that varied, bustling, busied life wast thou supremely happy. The people of Europe spoke of that western world, the discovery of which recently rewarded the daring venture of great navigators; and you were desirous to behold that new continent. Your master repeated the wish, and by my invisible agency ye stood in a few moments in the presence of the red men of North America. Again, you accompanied your master to the eternal ice of the northern pole, and from the doorway of the Esquimaux hut he beheld the wondrous play of the boreal lights. On a third occasion, and in obedience to your wish, you stood with your master in the island of Ceylon, where the first scene that presented itself to your view was an occurrence which, though terrible, is not uncommon in that reptile infested clime. Afterward, my power, although its active agency was but partially known to you, transported you and the count your master now my victim to the fantastic and interesting scenes of China, then to the court of the wife slaying tyrant of England, and subsequently to the most sacred privacy of the imperial palace at Constantinople. How varied have been thy travels, how rapid thy movements! And that the scenes which thine eyes did thus contemplate made a profound impression upon thy mind is proved by the pictures now hanging to the walls of thy late dwelling."
"But wherefore this recapitulation of everything I know so well already?"
asked Wagner.
to remind thee of the advantages of that power which Faust, thy master, possessed, and which ceased to be available to thee when the term of his compact with myself arrived. Yes," continued the demon emphatically, "the powers which he possessed may be possessed by thee, and thou mayest with a single word, at once and forever shake off the trammels of thy present doom the doom of a Wehr Wolf."
"Oh, to shake off these trammels were indeed a boon to be desired!"
exclaimed Wagner. "And to possess the power to gratify thy slightest whim," resumed the demon; "to possess the power to transport thyself at thy will to any clime, however distant; to be able to defy the machinations of men and the combination of adverse circumstances, such as have plagued thee into this dungeon; to be able, likewise, to say to thy beloved Nisida, 'Receive back the faculties which thou hast lost.'" But again was the smile sinister and strange that played upon the lips of the demon. But Wagner noticed it not: his imagination was excited by the subtle discourse to which he had lent so ready an ear.
"And hast thou the power," he cried impatiently, "to render me thus powerful?"
"I have," answered the demon.
"But the terms, the conditions, the compact?"
exclaimed Wagner, in feverish haste, though with foreboding apprehension. "Thine immortal soul!" responded the fiend, in a low but sonorous and horrifying whisper.
"No, no!" shrieked
Wagner, covering his face with his hands.
"Avaunt, Satan! I defy thee! 10,000 times preferable is the doom of the Wehr Wolf, appalling even though that be."
With folded arms and scornful countenance did the demon stand gazing upon Wagner, by the light of the supernatural luster which filled the cell. "Dost thou doubt my power?" he demanded, in a slow and imperious tone. "If so, put it to the test, unbelieving mortal that thou art! But remember, shouldst thou require evidence of that power which I propose to make available to thee, it must not be to give thee liberty, nor aught that may enhance thy interest."
"And any other evidence thou wilt give me?"
asked Wagner, a sudden idea striking him. "Yes," answered the demon, who doubtless divined his thoughts, for again did a scornful smile play upon his lips. "I will convince thee by any manifestation thou mayst demand, subject to the condition ere now named. I will convince thee that I am he whose power was placed at the disposal of thy late master, Faust, and by means of which thou wast transported, along with him, to every climate on the earth."
"I will name my wish,"
said Wagner. "Speak!" cried the fiend.
"Show me the Lady Nisida as she now is!"
exclaimed Fernand, his heart beating with the hope of beholding her whom he loved so devotedly; for with all the jealousy of a lover, was he anxious to convince himself that she was thinking of him. "Ah! 'tis the same as with Faust and his Theresa," murmured the demon to himself; then aloud he said, "Rather ask me to show you the Lady Nisida as she will appear 4 days hence."
"Be it so!"
cried Wagner, moved by the mysterious warning those words appeared to convey. The demon extended his arm, and chanted in deep sonorous tones the following incantation: "Ye powers of darkness who obey Eternally my potent sway, List to thy sovereign master's call, Transparent make this dungeon wall, And now annihilated be The space 'twixt Florence and the sea; Let the bright luster of the morn In golden glory steep Leghorn, Show where the dancing wavelets sport Round the gay vessels in the port, Those ships whose gilded lanterns gleam In the warm sun's refulgent beam, And whose broad pennants kiss the gale, Buoyed also by the spreading sail. Now let this mortal's vision mark Amidst that scene the corsair's bark, Clearing the port with swan like pride, Transparent make the black hull's side, And show the curtained cabin where Of earth's fair daughters the most fair Sits like an image of despair. Mortal, behold, thy Nisida is there." The strange phantasmagorian spectacle rapidly developed itself in obedience to the commands of the demon. First it appeared to Wagner that the supernatural luster which pervaded the dungeon, gathered like a curtain on one side, and occupied the place of the wall. This wondrous light became transparent, like a thin golden mist; and then the distant city of Leghorn appeared, producing an effect similar to that of the dissolving views, now familiar to every one.
The morning sun shone brightly on the fair scene, and a forest of masts stood out in bold relief against the western sky. The gilded lanterns on the poops of the vessels, the flags and streamers of various hues, the white sails of those ships that were preparing for sea, and the richly painted pinnaces that were shooting along in the channel between the larger craft, rendered the scene surpassingly gay and beautiful. But amidst the shipping, Wagner's eyes were suddenly attracted by a large galley, with 3 masts, looking most rakish with its snow white sail, its tapering spars, its large red streamer, and its low, long, and gracefully sweeping hull, which was painted jet black. On its deck were 6 pieces of brass ordnance, and stands of firearms were ranged round the lower parts of the masts. Altogether, the appearance of that vessel was as suspicious and menacing as it was gallant and graceful, and from the incantation of the demon, Wagner gleaned its real nature. And now, as that corsair ship moved slowly out of the port of Leghorn, its black side suddenly seemed to open, or at least to become transparent, and the interior of a handsomely fitted up cabin was revealed. Fernand's heart had already sunk within him through foreboding apprehension, but now an ejaculation of mingled rage and grief burst from his lips, when, on a sofa in that cabin, he beheld his dearly loved Nisida, seated, like an image of despair, motionless and still, as if all the energies of her haughty soul, all the powers of her strong mind had been suddenly paralyzed by the weight of misfortune. Wagner stood gazing, unable to utter another word beyond that one ejaculation of mingled rage and grief, gazing, himself a kindred image of despair upon this mysterious and unaccountable scene. But gradually the interior of the cabin grew more and more indistinct, until it was again completely shut in by the black side of the harbor, her dark hull disappearing by degrees, and melting away in the distance. Wagner dashed his open palm against his forehead, exclaiming, "Oh, Nisida, Nisida, who hath torn thee from me?" And he threw himself upon a seat, where he remained absorbed in a painful reverie, with his face buried in his hands, totally unmindful of the presence of the demon. 2 or 3 minutes passed, during which Fernand was deliberating within himself whether he were the sport of a wild and fanciful vision, or whether he had actually received a warning of the fate which hung over Nisida. "Art thou satisfied with the proof of my power?" demanded a deep voice, sounding ominously upon his ear. He raised his hand with a spasmodic start. Before him stood the demon with folded arms and scornful expression of countenance; and though the phantasmagorian scene had disappeared, the supernatural luster still pervaded the dungeon. "Fiend!" cried Wagner, impatiently, "thou hast mocked thou hast deceived me!" "Thus do mortals ever speak, even when I give them a glimpse of their own eventual fate, through the medium of painful dreams and hideous nightmares," said the demon, sternly. "But who has dared or rather, who will dare for that vision is a prospective warning of a deed to happen 4 days hence who then, I ask, will dare to carry off the Lady Nisida, my own loved and loving Nisida?" demanded Wagner, with increased impatience. "Stephano Verrina, the formidable captain of the Florentine banditti, has this night carried away thy lady love, Wagner," replied the demon. "Thou hast yet time to save her. Though the steed that bears her to Leghorn be fleet and strong, I can provide thee with a fleeter and a stronger. Nay, more become mine, consent to serve me as Faust served me, and within an hour within a minute, if thou wilt Nisida shall be restored to thee; she shall be released from the hands of her captors; thou shalt be free, and thy head shall be pillowed on her bosom, in whatever part of the earth it may suit thee thus to be united to her. Reflect, Wagner, I offer thee a great boon nay, many great boons the annihilation of those trammels which bind thee to the destiny of a Wehr Wolf, power unlimited for the rest of thy days, and the immediate possession of that Nisida whom thou lovest so fondly, and who is so beautiful, so exceedingly beautiful." Desperate was the struggle that took place in the breast of Wagner. On one side was all he coveted on earth on the other was the loss of the immortal soul. Here the possession of Nisida there her forced abduction by a brigand. Here his earthly happiness might be secured at the expense of his eternal welfare.
There his eternal welfare must be renounced if he decided in favor of his earthly happiness. What was he to do? Nisida was weighing in the balance against his immortal soul. To have Nisida, he must renounce his God. Oh, it was maddening maddening, this bewilderment. An hour to reflect, he cried, almost frantically.
Not a quarter of an hour,
returned the demon.
Nisida will be lost to you. Haste, decide.
Leave me for 5 minutes only.
No, not for a minute. Decide.
Wagner threw up his arms in the writhings of his ineffable anguish. His right hand came in contact with the crucifix that hung against the wall, and he mechanically clutched it, not with any motive prepense, but wildly, unwittingly. Terrific was the expression of rage which suddenly distorted the countenance of the demon. The lightnings of ineffable fury seemed to flash from his eyes and play upon his contracting brow, and yet a strong spasmodic shuddering at the same time convulsed his awful form. For as Wagner clung to the crucifix to prevent himself from falling at the feet of the malignant fiend, the symbol of Christianity was dragged by his weight from the wall, and, as Wagner reeled sideways, the cross which he retained with instinctive tenacity in his grasp, waved across the demon's face. Then, with a terrific howl of mingled rage and fear, the fiend fell back and disappeared through the earth, as if a second time hurled down in headlong flight before the thunderbolts of heaven. Wagner fell upon his knees and prayed fervently. Section 37 of Wagner the Wehr-Wolf by George W. M. Reynolds. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 36. The Trial of Ferdinand Wagner. On the ensuing morning Wagner stood before the judge of the criminal tribunal of the Republic. The judgment hall was a large and lofty room in the Palazzo del Podesta, or ducal palace. The judges sat in antique and richly carved chairs, placed on a platform beneath a canopy of purple velvet fringed with gold. On the left, at a handsome desk covered with papers, was seated the procurator fiscal or attorney general of the republic, distinguished in attire from the judges only by the fact of the ermine upon his scarlet robe being narrower than theirs. Opposite to this functionary was a bench whereon the witnesses were placed. The prisoner stood between two sbirri in a small pew, in the centre of the court. Defendants in civil cases were alone permitted in that age and country to retain counsel in their behalf. Persons accused of crimes were debarred this privilege. Wagner was therefore undefended. The proceedings of the tribunal were usually conducted privately, but about a dozen gentlemen and twice as many ladies had obtained orders of admission on this occasion, the case having produced considerable sensation in Florence on account of the reputed wealth of the accused. Perhaps, also, the rumor that he was a young man endowed with extraordinary personal attractions had exercised its influence upon the susceptible hearts of the Florentine ladies. Certain it is, that when he was conducted into the judgment hall, his strikingly handsome exterior, his air of modest confidence, his graceful gait, and his youthful appearance, so far threw into the background the crime imputed to him, that the ladies present felt their sympathies deeply enlisted in his behalf. The usher of the tribunal having commanded silence in a loud voice, the chief judge began the usual interrogatory of the prisoner. To the questions addressed to him, the accused replied that his name was Ferdinand Wagner, that he was a native of Germany, that he had no profession, avocation, nor calling, that he was possessed of a large fortune, and that having traveled over many parts of the world, he settled in Florence, where he had hoped to enjoy a tranquil and peaceful existence. "The murdered female was reputed to be your sister," said the chief judge. "Was such the fact?" "She was a near relative," answered Wagner.
"But was she your sister?" demanded the procurator fiscal.
"She was not."
"Then in what degree of relationship did she stand toward you?" asked the chief judge.
"I must decline to reply to that question."
"The tribunal infers, therefore, that the murdered female was not related to you at all," observed the judge. "Was she not your mistress?"
"No, my lord,"
cried Wagner emphatically.
"As truly as heaven now hears my assertion, it was not so."
"Was she your wife?" demanded the chief judge. A negative answer was given.
The chief judge and the procurator fiscal then by turns questioned and cross questioned the prisoner in the most subtle manner, to induce him to state the degree of relationship subsisting between himself and Agnes; but he either refused to respond to their queries, or else answered direct ones by means of a positive denial. The lieutenant of the sbirri was at length called upon to give an account of the discovery of the dead body and the suspicious circumstances which had led to the arrest of Wagner. Two of these circumstances appeared to be very strong against him. The first was the soiled and blood-stained appearance of the garments which were found in his chamber; the other was the exclamation, "But how did you know that it is Agnes who is murdered?" uttered before any one had informed who had been murdered. Wagner was called upon for an explanation. He stated that he had been out the whole night, that the blood upon his garments had flowed from his own body, which had been scratched and torn in the mazes of the woods; that on his return home he met Agnes in the garden; that he had left her there; and that he was told a young lady had been assassinated in the vicinity of his dwelling. He immediately conceived that the victim must be Agnes. When questioned concerning the motives of his absence from home during the entire night, he maintained a profound silence; but he was evidently much agitated and excited by the queries thus put to him. He said nothing about the stranger lady who had so frequently terrified Agnes, because, in relating the proceedings of that mysterious female in respect to his deceased granddaughter, especially the incident of the abstraction of antique jewels which the late Count of Riverola had given to her, he would have been compelled to enter into details concerning the amour between those who were no more; and this subject he was solicitous to avoid, not only through respect for the memory of the murdered Agnes, but also to spare the feelings of Count Francisco and Donna Nisida. The judges and the procurator fiscal, finding that they could elicit nothing from Wagner relative to the cause of his absence from home during the night preceding the murder, passed on to another subject. "In the apartment belonging to your residence," said the chief judge, "there are several pictures and portraits." Wagner turned pale and trembled. The chief judge made a signal to an officer of the court, and that functionary quitted the judgment hall. In a few minutes he returned, followed by three subordinates bearing the two portraits mentioned in the 6th chapter of this tale, and also the frame covered over with a large piece of black cloth. On perceiving this last object, Wagner became paler still, and trembled violently. "There are 6 other pictures in the room whence these have been taken," said the judge; "but these 6 are not of a character to interest the tribunal. We, however, require explanations concerning the 2 portraits and the frame with the black cloth cover now before us." The greatest excitement at present prevailed amongst the audience. "On one of the portraits," continued the chief judge, "there is an inscription to this effect: 'F., Count of A., terminated his career on the 1st of August, 1517.' What does this inscription mean?"
"It means that Faust, Count of Orana, was a nobleman with whom I traveled during a period of 18 months,"
replied Wagner.
"and he died on the day mentioned in that inscription."
"The world has heard strange reports relative to Faust," said the chief judge, in a cold voice, and with unchanged manner, although the mention of that name had produced a thrill of horror on the part of his brother judges and the audience. "Art thou aware that rumor ascribes him a compact with the evil one?" Wagner gazed around him in horrified amazement, for the incident of the preceding night returned with such force to his mind that he could scarcely subdue an agonizing ebullition of emotion. The chief judge next recited the inscription on the other portrait: "F.W., January 7th, 1516, his last day thus." But Wagner maintained a profound silence, and neither threats nor entreaties could induce him to give the least explanation concerning that inscription. "Let us then proceed to examine this frame with the black cloth cover," said the chief judge. "My lord," whispered one of his brother judges, "in the name of the Blessed Virgin, have naught more to do with this man. Let him go forth to execution. He is a monster of atrocity, evidently a murderer, doubtless leagued with the evil one, as Faust, of whose acquaintance he boasts, was before him." "For my part, I credit not such idle tales," interrupted the chief judge; "and it is my determination to sift this matter to the very foundation. I am rather inclined to believe that the prisoner is allied with the banditti who infest the republic than with any preternatural powers. His absence from home during the entire night, according to his own admission, his immense wealth, without any ostensible resources, all justify my suspicion. Let the case proceed," added the chief judge aloud, for he had made the previous observations in a low tone. "Usher, remove the black cloth from the picture."
"No, no!"
exclaimed Wagner wildly, and he was about to rush from the dock, but the sbirri held him back. The usher's hand was already on the black cloth. "I beseech your lordship to pause," whispered the assistant judge who had before spoken. "Proceed!" exclaimed the presiding functionary in a loud authoritative tone, for he was a bold and fearless man. And scarcely were these words uttered, when the black cloth was stripped from the frame, and the usher who had removed the covering recoiled with a cry of horror, as his eyes obtained a glimpse of the picture which was now revealed to view. "What means this folly?" ejaculated the chief judge. "Bring the picture hither." The usher, awed by the manner of this great functionary, raised the picture in such a way that the judges and the procurator fiscal might obtain a full view of it. "A Wehr Wolf!" ejaculated the assistant judge, who had previously remonstrated with his superior, and his countenance became pale as death. The dreadful words were echoed by other tongues in the court, and a panic fear seized on all save the chief judge and Wagner himself. The former smiled contemptuously; the latter had summoned all his courage to aid him to pass through this terrible ordeal without confirming by his conduct the dreadful suspicion which had been excited in respect to him. For oh! the subject of that picture was indeed awful to contemplate. It had no inscription, but it represented, with the most painful and horrifying fidelity, the writhings and agonizing throes of the human being during the process of transformation into the lupine monster. The countenance of the unhappy man had already elongated into one of savage and brute like shape, and so admirably had art counterfeited nature, that the rich garment seemed changed into a rough, shaggy, and wiry skin. The effect produced by that picture was indeed a thrilling and appalling interest. "A Wehr Wolf!" had exclaimed one of the assistant judges; and while the voices of several of the male spectators in the body of the court echoed the words mechanically, the ladies gave vent to screams, as they rushed toward the doors of the tribunal. In a few moments that part of the court was entirely cleared. "Prisoner," exclaimed the chief judge, "have you aught more to advance in your defense relative to the charge of murder?"
"My lord, I am innocent,"
said Wagner, firmly but respectfully. "The tribunal pronounces you guilty," continued the chief judge. Then, with a scornful smile toward his assistants and the procurator fiscal, who all three, as well as the sbirri and the officers of the court, were pale and trembling with vague fear, the presiding functionary continued thus: "The tribunal condemns you, Fernand Wagner, to death by the hand of the common headsman, and it is now my duty to name the day and fix the hour for your execution. Therefore I do ordain that the sentence just pronounced be carried into effect precisely at the hour of sunset on the last day of the present month." My lord," exclaimed the procurator fiscal, "the belief is that on the last day of each month, and at the hour of sunset." "I am aware of the common superstition," interrupted the chief judge, coldly and sternly; "and it is to convince the world of the folly of putting faith in such legends that I have fixed that day and that hour in the present instance. Away with the prisoner to his dungeon." And the chief judge waved his hand imperiously, to check any further attempts at remonstrance. But his assistant functionaries, the procurator fiscal, and the officers of the court, surveyed him with mingled surprise and awe, uncertain whether they ought to applaud his courage or tremble at his rashness. Wagner had maintained a calm and dignified demeanor during the last portion of the proceedings; and although the sbirri who had charge of him ventured not to lay a finger upon him, he accompanied them back to the prison of the Palazzo del Podesta. Section 37.